Well, welcome everyone to our Spotlight evening, and thank you for coming. And a special welcome to Peter Killingley. Thank you for coming to speak to us. Just a few notices to share with you. So we've got home groups this week, so please do go along and discuss the ministry from this morning. There's a women's evening coming up on Saturday. There's a fellowship lunch next week. So there's still some slots to fill in. If you could just sign up there and bring something along, that would be helpful. I think that's the only last thing I want to say is about we've got some Advent books that are free for you to take just to help you with your personal devotions. So the idea is one per household. Take one if it's going to be helpful to you. It takes you through some of the chapters in Isaiah that point to Jesus. Just to explain how this evening is going to work, in a moment I'll hand over to Peter. Or Pete, you prefer Pete, do you?
I prefer Pete, but either's good.
Pete. Then he'll give us a presentation for 30 to 40 minutes roughly, or 50, 60, however long it's going to be.
I thought it was 120.
120, okay, so it's going to be a long evening.
I don't know, but I imagine it'll be 45.
Okay, that's great. And then we'll pause and we'll have some refreshments, hopefully, Rachel permitting. And then we'll, in that refreshment time, it's the same format that we usually have. There's some paper here, there's some pens here. If you've got some questions you'd like to ask Peter, feel free to write them down, and then he'll attempt to answer some of them after the break, and then we'll close. So that's it. I'll just pray, and then I'll hand over to Pete. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are good, that you are wise, that there's no one who knows better than you. Thank you, Lord, that you are compassionate, you are loving, and you are good. And so, Father, as we think about some of these difficult things this evening, Lord, we pray that you would give Pete your wisdom, and Lord, help us to be able to see the truth in your word and to be able to weigh these things with compassionate, loving hearts. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Matt. Thank you all for your welcome today. I've enjoyed being here, enjoyed hospitality this afternoon, just enjoyed some of the conversations I had after the service this morning. So it's been a joy to be with you all. Now, just as we begin, I'm going to skip through the first few slides, and here we go. So the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey, he wrote to MPs earlier this year to say that supporting assisted suicide is a profoundly Christian thing to do. Full quote is this: "It is profoundly Christian to do all we can to ensure nobody suffers against their wishes." And I think that sums up really well the well-meaning confusion in large parts of the church. Because as Christians, we can find ourselves in a strange position when it comes to assisted suicide. And that's because the other side, let's call it, the pro-assisted suicide lobby, they use a lot of words that Christians will often use. For example, assisted suicide is most often framed in terms of being a compassionate approach. And as Christians, we hear that and we want to say, compassion, yes, we love compassion. We're the people of compassion, and the arguments framed in terms of compassion, they pull at our heartstrings. Or, in other words, dignity. So the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, not the catchiest title, they rebranded themselves a few years ago as Dignity in Dying. And again, as Christians, we want to say, well, we believe in human dignity. We're always talking about human dignity and the dignity of every life because they're made in the image of God. And so when the argument is framed in these terms of dignity and compassion, it can leave us wondering, well, maybe there's something to this. And there are some who privately think, look, I know assisted suicide is supposed to be bad as a Christian, but I kind of see where they're coming from. So cards on the table. I work for an organization called CARE, and we actively campaign against legalizing assisted suicide. By the end of this talk, you'll see why. If you were here this morning, you'll have heard me talk about CARE. I'll do it much quicker this time. CARE stands for Christian Action, Research and Education. For 40 years, we've been based in Westminster, just across from the Houses of Parliament. And our mission is to see politics renewed and lives transformed. So if you think about the church's main gospel is to preach the gospel. As you go through the Bible, Old Testament and New, we see that loving your neighbour cannot be limited to caring for their spiritual needs alone. Love includes seeking good government, campaigning for better laws. That's what we're all about. Equipping politicians to stand up for the weak and vulnerable, engaging churches, and empowering the next generation through our leadership program. And we're all about truth and grace, salt and light. And if you want to find out more about CARE, come and chat to me afterwards. Before we go any further, it's kind of obvious, but I do want to say this talk covers sensitive issues of life and death and pain and suffering. And it might bring up some very personal things. And my heart, it's not for issues, it's not for being on the right side of a topic, it's for people. And so if something comes up and you want to chat to me or to Matt, your pastor, or to one of your elders afterwards, please do so. Here's our roadmap for tonight. We're going to lay the groundwork. What are the definitions? What's the law? Then look at the argument in favor of assisted suicide. Then some biblical principles. Then the arguments against before we land the plane by thinking, well, what can we do? And then we can look forward to questions afterwards. And just to say, I love questions, and I'll be very disappointed if I don't get lots and lots of questions. So please feel free to ask anything you want about assisted suicide. So let's get going with the most exciting part, which is definitions. Actually, this is really important, because often what happens is there can be a blurring of language, deliberate ambiguity, and words can be used to obscure the reality of what's going on. So let's get a few terms clear. Start with the first one, mercy killing. And that is when somebody kills another person to end their suffering. The word mercy is in there because there's compassionate motives, but that obscures the fact that it is still committing murder, or at the very least, manslaughter. Even with the person's consent, even if they're asking you to do it. There's an example you might have seen in the news over the summer, the case of David Hunter. He was a coal miner from Northumberland. He'd been married to his wife Janice for 56 years. They retired, they moved to Cyprus, and she became increasingly unwell. She had blood cancer, she was in a great deal of pain. Her life was just becoming more and more diminished, and for a long period of time she just wanted to die, wanted her suffering to be ended, and she begged him repeatedly to just put her out of her misery. And so in 2021, that's what he did. He smothered her with a pillow at her request. He tried to kill himself. He was unsuccessful. He was initially convicted in Cyprus of murder. It was later reduced to manslaughter. But either way, that's an example of mercy killing. It's driven by a desire to end suffering, but it is still killing. Euthanasia is the next word. It literally means good death from the Greek. A doctor, in this case, will administer an injection which contains a lethal dose of barbiturates. Basically, barbiturates are like sedatives. They're used in anesthesia, but if you give a high enough dose, it has the effect of putting the patient into a coma, bringing about a swift death. And it's framed as better than mercy killing because it's more clinical, but it is still an intentional act that takes someone's life, and in the UK, it is still illegal. It's still murder or manslaughter. Next up is assisted suicide, and this is kind of a step down again, if you like. It's where the doctor gives the lethal drug to the patient, but then the patient administers it themselves. So the doctor's one step removed, but still heavily involved. That's also illegal in this country. And then the next one, assisted dying. Assisted dying is a phrase used by a lot of people campaigning for the law to be changed. They say it differs from assisted suicide in that it's down to if you're dying anyway. Say you've got a terminal illness, less than 6 months to live, something like that. But in law and in practice, it's the same as assisted suicide. It's the same act. That the medic gives the drug to the patient with the intention that the patient will then take the drug to end his or her life. So assisted dying is just another form of assisted suicide. So all of that is and has been illegal in this country. But there are some acts that doctors take that sometimes could be seen as a little bit similar on the surface, but are very different from an ethical standpoint. So, for example, there's a do not resuscitate order. DNR. These were really controversial during COVID, weren't they? Because the DNR order was added to a lot of patients' medical records that they'd agreed to a DNR when they hadn't. And that is unethical. That's wrong. But a DNR is in a different category from the things on the left of the screen. Because those are positive acts taken with the intention of ending a life. A DNR is a decision not to give someone CPR if they stop breathing or their heart stops beating. And this is always an incredibly painful and difficult decision to make, but often it's the right decision. CPR is incredibly traumatic for the body. It doesn't cure the underlying illness, and it can leave someone with severe long-term effects which they may never recover from. So a DNR done rightly, that's a legitimate medical decision. Another term that we could talk about is withdrawing medical treatment. So sometimes it gets to the point where you say, look, we've done all we can. We're just prolonging life at the moment, and we're going to stop doing that. We're going to manage your pain instead. And that's a hard decision again, but ethically legitimate. There's no positive act there with the intention of killing. And if a doctor does that, he or she will give pain relief to ease the process of dying, and you can often be given, again, incredibly strong drugs there. And the drugs you're giving there, they're not designed to kill, but to reduce pain. Sometimes they might have the effect of speeding up death. But that's not the intent behind giving the pain relief. It's called the doctrine of double effect. It's all down to the intention, and that makes the world of difference. So the things on the left are all illegal at the moment in this country. The things on the right are not, and are kind of legitimate medical treatments. Globally, this is the picture. The countries in green have all legalized euthanasia, so that includes Canada, Australia, Colombia, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. Those in purple have legalized assisted suicide, so that includes a lot of US states, includes Austria, includes Switzerland, which was famously the first country to legalize it back in the 40s. And then there's some yellow ones, just to confuse us. That is where the parliaments of Germany and Italy have been ordered by their courts to introduce some form of assisted suicide, but the parliament needs to decide what it's going to look like. Closer to home in Jersey, MPs have now approved assisted suicide in principle, and on the Isle of Man last month, the assisted dying bill received a 70% majority, and so that is on track to be passed in the next year. But over to the UK, closer to home, the law as it stands is mercy killing and euthanasia are simply murder or manslaughter, and assisted suicides or assisted dying is also a criminal act. So under the Suicide Act 1961, a person commits an offence if he does an act capable of encouraging or assisting the suicide or attempted suicide of another person. And the act was intended to encourage or assist suicide or an attempt at suicide. Now, prosecutions under that act are pretty rare. In the last 14 years, there's been 182 cases investigated by police. Only 22 of those made it to court, and there have been 4 convictions. But there's been this campaign for years, for decades, to change the law in the UK and make assisted suicide legal. The last big push in kind of UK-wide was in 2015. It was defeated in the House of Commons. And CARE have been involved in fighting back and defeating a number of different assisted suicide bills over the years. But we can't be complacent about it. If we look at the shifts in culture and the push towards autonomy and individualism, my right to choose, and the fact that other countries are doing this, we'd be naive to think the pressure isn't going to increase. So that's the groundwork. That's kind of like a little, where are we? What are the terms? What's the law at the moment? But we're going to move on now to the argument for assisted suicide. And I think this is really important because we want to represent the other side fairly and well. We want to, there's no point just setting up a really bad argument like a straw man and tearing it down. That doesn't actually help us. So let's really try and explore what are the arguments behind assisted suicide. And it boils down basically to these 3 categories. They probably wouldn't use this language, but it boils down to the categories: we need it, we want it, and we can control it. So the first one, we need it. This is the argument that for many of us, this is the strongest argument. It's the argument rooted in compassion. It says, look at the unimaginable suffering some people go through. There's a story on the website of Dignity in Dying, a story written by a woman called Heather McQueen. She tells the story of her mum. She says, my mum was 79 when she died from cancer. She was one of those brave people who never complain. The radiotherapy treatment for her cancer had left her with 3rd-degree burns. Lying down was particularly painful. She was so sore sitting down, she had to eat standing up, and then the doctors found a tumor blocking her stomach, so she could no longer digest food. She spent her final week in hospital. She couldn't take fluids by mouth. She was in great pain from the radiation burns and the tumors and all the tubes. She could not speak, but she would regularly try to say 2 things. She would try to mouth the word sore, or she would hold 2 fingers to her hand, two fingers to her mouth in the motion of a gun. She says, my mum had a massive turnout at her funeral. Almost everyone who contacted me afterwards said what a kind and funny person she was. She had a great life and an absolutely horrible death. So this strand of the argument says, look at the incredible suffering that some people endure. And they rightly want to alleviate, to end that suffering. There's no medical treatment, it's only getting worse. We could end this suffering. In the name of compassion, we need this law to change. It's argument number 1. Argument number 2 is the autonomy argument. Just for shorthand, we call it we want it. But it's the argument based on autonomy. Why shouldn't we be able to choose when we die? So to quote the poem Invictus, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Yeah, many people say, look, I don't believe in God. Who are you with your religious objections to deny me the right to end my life in the time and way of my choosing? Or Sir Patrick Stewart, patron for the lobby group Dignity in Dying, says, we have no control over how we arrive in the world, but at the end of life we should have control over how we leave it. Debbie Purdy, a lady who was diagnosed with progressive MS at the age of just 31. I love my life, but I have always been a fiercely independent woman, and I want to have a choice about how and when I die. And all of this is really rooted in J.S. Mill from the Enlightenment My daughter's studying philosophy at the moment at college, and she's reading all sorts of J.S. Mill stuff. But basically, he says, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Over himself, over his body and mind, the individual is sovereign. So that's the we wanted argument. We want it. We should be allowed to have it. And the third argument is we can control it. And slightly less catchy, the public policy argument. See, campaigners are realistic. They say we recognize that this is something that could be open to abuse if we don't do it properly. We've heard some of the stories from other nations, but we've got the right safeguards. If we do this our way, the law will never be abused or misused. So we can control it if we do this right. So we need it, we want it, and we can control it. Let's just take a moment to acknowledge the strength of these arguments in today's world. And that first one, the we need it, the compassion argument, it's so powerful because who wants to be on the other side of that? Who wants to be the one saying, no, we don't want to reduce suffering? And looking someone in the eye, either for themselves or for a loved one who's begging for the law change and saying no, is really hard. And if the third argument is true, that we can do it safely, then why shouldn't we allow it? You think, why would my morality stop others from having what they want? It's like the same-sex marriage argument. They used to say, if you don't believe in same-sex marriage, don't have one. Don't stop us from having them. And now it's, if you don't believe in assisted suicide, don't do it. Don't stop us from doing it. Yes, live and let live, except it's not quite. It's live and let die. And as Christians, sometimes we can think, oh, okay, maybe you're right. After all, I don't want to impose my morality on you. But here's the thing. No, we don't want to impose morality, but we do want to love our neighbor. So before we go, we'll come back to each of those three and look at where they fall short a little bit. But before we do that, what I want to do is just bring in a few biblical principles so we can see what God is saying to us on this issue. So I've got three principles that I'll just talk about for a few minutes. I don't think there's anything particularly groundbreaking here, but it's so helpful for us to remember what are the key principles from the Bible. The first one is life is valuable. As humans, we are made in the image of God. That's the most incredible truth. Genesis 1:27, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And we are like God in a way that is true of no other animal. And we reflect his glory in a way that not even the stars or the planets are able to. Even the most glorious nebula seen through the most advanced telescope is nothing compared to you and me. We have an inherent dignity that comes from being made in the image of God and an inherent value of every life. And in Genesis 9, it's because we are made in the image of God that taking a human life is such a somber and serious act. So Genesis 9:6. It says, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. So that seems to be introducing some form of capital punishment. But less worried about that, more thinking about the reasoning then given. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. Why? For in the image of God has God made mankind. See, taking a life is such a serious and somber act that, in fact, the only appropriate punishment is to take another life. So that's our first biblical principle. It's that life is valuable. The second one is that it is God who gives and takes life. Psalm 139, very well known verses. You created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And then there's Hannah's song in 1 Samuel chapter 2. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. There are 2 instances in the Bible of euthanasia or requested euthanasia where somebody asks somebody else to kill them. Neither of them is portrayed positively. One of them is in the book of Judges, and the general rule of thumb is if they do it in Judges, it's not a good idea. It's Abimelech in Judges chapter 9. The other one is King Saul. Perhaps you know the story. He's mortally wounded. He asks his servant to end his suffering by running him through with a sword. So it's precisely the euthanasia or assisted suicide debate, isn't it? It's like, I am dying, I'm suffering, will you please end my suffering, make this quick? But the servant refuses. Later, though, an Amalekite claims to have done the deed. He recounts, probably untruthfully, he tells a story to David. He says, Saul said to me, stand here next to me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. So the Amalekite claims to have then committed this act of euthanasia out of compassion, but he's not then praised for his mercy and compassion. He's condemned as being guilty of murder. Compare that with Job. Job goes through unimaginable suffering, doesn't he? And he pleads with God to take his life. He says, oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant what I hope for, that God would be willing to crush me, to let loose his hand and cut off my life. You see, he longs for death, but he doesn't take matters into his own hands, nor does he ask another to do so. He sees it's for God to give and take life. Now, of course, there's the cross as well, isn't there, where the Roman soldiers come to put those being crucified out of their misery, but that's a bit different. I don't think that's driven by compassion. I think that's driven by efficiency. They want to speed the deaths of the men on the cross who are being crucified to avoid civil unrest. So I think that's a slightly different case. But it is for God to give and take life. And the third principle that guides our thinking, and we saw this morning, is that we must stand up for the weak and the vulnerable. See, evidence from all over the world, and we'll go into this a bit in a minute, shows that time and time again, they are the victims when the law on assisted suicide is changed. It's the elderly who are pressured by their families because they don't want to care for them. It's the poor who are told there isn't funding for treatment for your health condition, but have you thought about a nice assisted suicide? It's the disabled who are told that their lives are no longer worth protecting, which is why every single disability campaign group is against the change in the law. It's those with mental health struggles who previously we said, well, we'll do anything to stop you committing suicide. Now they're told, well, your lives aren't necessarily worth saving or fighting for. Go ahead with it. And in some countries, it's children who wouldn't be old enough to consent to a tattoo, who are led by misguided adults to their own deaths. So Proverbs 31 calls us to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. So no, I don't think we're imposing on morality. I think we're loving our neighbour. So that's just 3 biblical principles. Let's jump on. It's good that we understand the biblical principles, actually, and that we're ready to argue them, but it's not always the best approach. Sometimes it is. Sometimes you want to be able to talk about these 3. So go back and explain to people life's valuable, God gives and takes life. We've got to stand up for the poor and the weak and the oppressed. But sometimes, actually, that's not, it's just another religious nut arguing about the Bible. I don't believe the Bible, not interested. And it's about knowing your audience, I think. So another approach is actually to look at those 3 categories of arguments and unravel them a little bit. So we need it, we want it, we can control it. So let's just take a few minutes just to do that. I hope you're staying with me, staying awake. First one, we can control it. We can't. Slippery slope arguments get a really bad reputation. They actually can be quite solid arguments if they're used rightly. And what you've got to explore is there a logical connection between point A and point B on the argument? Is there a logical difference between someone who's going to die in 6 months or 3 years? What happens when the court case is brought by the person who falls just outside the rules, who has a horrific lifelong condition maybe, but it's not terminal? Once the door's been opened, the court is going to find it really difficult to say, no, this is just, this is fair, because you're excluded. They're going to say, well, if the law's opened the door, you should be included as well. And in every country which has legalized assisted suicide, the criteria go out over time. It starts out with 6 months to live, terminal condition, and it goes on to unbearable suffering, which really can be defined however you like. And it goes on to no life-threatening illness even. In Canada, it's no longer just for people with terminal illnesses. It was legalized in Canada in 2016. Now it's any significant disability or disease, even if not life-threatening. But even as the criteria have gone out in Canada, public support has grown for it to go out further. There's now popular support in Canada for homelessness and drug addiction becoming new criteria. In the Netherlands, the law started with having an incurable illness. Now people have been euthanized because of loneliness, which causes them mental suffering. And in the news a couple of weeks ago, 5 people were euthanized in the Netherlands for the sole factor of having autism. So that there's going to be expansion of the criteria because any limits, by their very nature, are arbitrary. And I think there's an institutional arrogance that says, we won't be like that, we'll get better safeguards in place than all the other nations before us. So the criteria go out, the age goes down. This is less inevitable. It doesn't happen everywhere, and it differs from nation to nation, but in many nations the age has gone down to the point where in the Netherlands the legal limit for euthanasia is 1 year old. And in Belgium there is no lower limit. Age goes down and numbers go up year on year. More and more people access it. Canada, in the first year, it was 1,018 people. Just 5 years later, it was 10 times that, 10,064. We can't control it. It is like Pandora's box when you open it. The next argument was we want it, and what I want to say here is wanting it isn't enough. The decisions we make impact others, don't they? It's not just between me and my doctor. No man is an island. And there are all sorts of unintended consequences that affect people's lives if you open this door. And that's what it's about. It's not about abstract legal debates. It's about people and people's lives. And these are some of the consequences that have been seen in every other country that's legalized it. So the first one is it changes the nature of healthcare. So John Wyatt, many of you will know John Wyatt. He's like the premier Christian ethicist in the UK on issues of life and death and medical ethics and all sorts of things. He's written what he calls the first rule of health economics, which is the cheapest patient is a dead patient. And he says there's been a shift in the last few days. If you go back a few decades, I think I said days, I meant decades. If you go back a few decades, under the old kind of paternalism, he calls it, he says the allocation and distribution of healthcare was controlled by the medical profession. So if you wanted access to a new treatment, that was the gatekeepers were the doctors or the nurses or whoever else. In the new paternalism, in the modern world, it is controlled by health economists. The access to treatment is now very much determined by can it be afforded. And research has been done on how much the NHS would save if assisted suicides were legal. And if you add that to the current political debates about the NHS, you can see why that would be attractive to many to save the NHS money. And you could, and many people would, get told, well, we can't fund your treatment, but have you thought about assisted suicide? Treatment is almost always more costly than killing. Another case in Canada, there was a a lady who's a Paralympian and ex-military. She'd been wounded in the military, and she needed a stair lift for her home. And so she wrote to the government asking for some details on funding for stair lifts, and what she got back in the post was, "Can't do that. Have you thought about assisted suicide?" And so there are times when treatment can't be funded, but assisted suicide can. And I don't mean to be kind of morbid, but in that world, how comfortable would you be with your elderly relatives visiting the doctor without you by their side? In Belgium, there was an incident where a woman in her 60s was euthanized because she was struggling with depression. The first her children heard anything about it was when the hospital called to ask what they wanted them to do with her remains. So it changes our relationship with healthcare. It changes our view of mental health. See, in every country, again, where assisted suicide or euthanasia have been legalized, other suicides have also increased. So we generally say, rightly, as a society, we want to reduce the number of people taking their own lives. And we commend the brave people who will often risk everything to save someone trying to harm themselves. And in recent decades, there's been a wonderful increase in funding for mental health services because we recognize that people need support in those dark times. This changes that. I know people who've been through suicidal times. I'm sure you do as well. And some of my friends have been at the stage where if assisted suicide was available, they would have taken it. Yet they're now through the worst and glad that the option was never there. And one of the arguments often used is, well, let's legalize assisted suicide because people are going to do it anyway, and this will at least they'll at least do this in a kind of a neat, clean, tidy way rather than causing trauma to others by jumping in front of a train or something. But in every country it becomes legal. Normal suicides don't go down. The other suicides also go up because it changes our view of mental health. Changes our view of disability. I've touched on this already. All disability groups advocate against a change in the law because disability becomes a problem to be solved rather than people to be loved. And actually, astonishingly, this doesn't happen often, I found myself agreeing with Humza Yousaf, the First Minister in Scotland, head of the SNP. He recently came out to say he has grown in his opposition to assisted suicide, and he said it's because of meeting with disability groups. They persuaded him. Changes our relationship with the poor. You see, it's often the rich who are the campaigners here, and the poor are the victims. I keep coming back to examples from Canada. I think it's because it's a country that's not dissimilar from ours and just a few years ahead in some respects. There's a Canadian doctor. She's publicly spoken about having killed 400 people legally through euthanasia. But about one of them, she said about this person, she didn't want to die, but she was suffering terribly and had maxed out all her credit cards. She had no other option. And it sounds so brutal when you put it like this, but effectively it boils down to kill the poor rather than love them. And it shifts an entire society's attitudes, not just the odd doctor. So now, if you look at Canadians under the age of 35, nearly half of them, as I've said, think poverty and homelessness should be grounds for assisted suicide. And there was a headline in the news in The Spectator last year, "Why is Canada euthanizing the poor?" Changes our view of ourselves. I wonder how many people have been told by an elderly relative, "I don't want to be a burden." I wonder how many of you have said that yourself, "I don't want to be a burden." Now people are being given the option, you don't have to be a burden. In the state of Oregon in the US, 50% of people who choose to kill themselves give perceiving self as a burden to others as one of their reasons. Half the people doing it in Oregon, it's because they don't want to be a burden. But we come into the world as burdens. We leave the world as burdens. At various times in our lives, we bear one another's burdens. Let us just once and for all ditch the phrase, "I don't want to be a burden," and rather do everything we can to avoid becoming a society where someone chooses to die rather than being a burden to their relatives. And lastly, it changes our relationship with death. Sort of. I say sort of, only Jesus changes our relationship with death. But by making assisted suicide an option, it's giving us a power that people don't want or need. It increases our existential anguish about what we should do. As a French philosopher, René Girard, he said, the experience of death is going to get more and more painful. Euthanasia will make it more painful because it will put the emphasis on personal decision in a way which was blissfully alien to the whole problem of dying in former times. It will make death even more subjectively intolerable, for people will feel responsible for their own deaths and morally obligated to rid their relatives of their unwanted presence. Euthanasia will intensify all the problems it claims to solve. So some people wanting it, particularly rich campaigners wanting it, it's not enough to fundamentally change all those things. They're all the unintended consequences. And we haven't even covered those who would use it as an opportunity for maliciousness. And we're naive, again, if we don't think some people will put pressure on elderly relatives. But why would I want my inheritance spent on care home fees? We're promised that there would be safeguards, but we're told the same about online banking fraud, aren't we? And banks have all these checks and warnings, and they're supposed to know when somebody's being pressured to move money as part of a scam, yet the amount taken by online banking frauds is soaring into the billions. Are we expecting doctors in the same way to always notice when someone vulnerable is being pushed into a decision? So, wanting it isn't enough. Lastly, we need something else. So that's unimaginable suffering. We need it just because of the extent of the suffering. We should not be blasé in the face of that. But there are other ways of dealing with suffering rather than eliminating the sufferer. In our culture, suffering is viewed as the ultimate evil, the worst thing, to be removed at all costs. And it is an evil, isn't it? It's a reflection of what is wrong with the world, but the solution is found in Jesus and his work, and in the future hope of a world with no death and no pain and no tears. And in the meantime, we are not able to eliminate suffering, and we are not called to eliminate sufferers as a shortcut to doing that. So what we need is not assisted suicide or euthanasia. What we need is palliative care. Palliative care is the medical, emotional, spiritual, physical care given to a person who is terminally ill. It's when you get to the stage we're no longer trying to cure the illness or disease. We are looking to reduce your suffering as you walk these final days or weeks or years of your life. It was pioneered in the UK as a medical discipline by a Christian lady, Cicely Saunders, born in 1918. She's a Christian. She worked in caring for patients with terminal illnesses. She founded the first modern-day hospice. She did all sorts of research. She became the foremost advocate for quality end-of-life care. And she built this model of palliative care, which was not just about pain management, although it included that, but caring for the practical and emotional and spiritual and social needs of the patient, as well as their families. And she's quoted as saying, "You matter because you are you. And you matter to the end of your life. We will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but to live until you die." And that is so hopeful in comparison to the message of assisted suicide. Now, there's so much more to be done in the world of palliative care. The UK is a world leader, but provision is patchy. It kind of depends where you live a little bit. There needs to be more funding. And at CARE, we've done a lot in the House of Lords on increasing access to palliative care. And we're not naive about that. It doesn't eliminate suffering completely. It doesn't make every death easy. And it doesn't remove some of the horrendous cases. But it's a more holistic and hopeful approach than eliminating the sufferer. And it's the best and most compassionate way of helping those who are suffering the most. Assisted suicide is presented as neat and clean and easy. In reality, it's an attempt to control one of the messiest and most uncontrollable parts of the human story. And it doesn't deliver. And in the end, we need not just palliative care, we need resurrection hope. This is the true solution to suffering. It's that even the worst suffering is small in comparison to the eternal weight of glory that awaits us. That's not to diminish suffering, it's to elevate glory. Romans 8:18, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. Or 2 Corinthians 4, it captures the same idea. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. This light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. And ultimately what we need is the resurrection, isn't it? For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? So that's the response to the pro arguments. That's the con arguments. We're going to take a short 5-minute break from me talking, watching a short video before I then wrap up this section of the evening. We can have something to eat and drink. Remember, be thinking of questions that we can cover in a few minutes. But this video is Tony's story. Tony was the husband of the former CEO of CARE called Nola Leach. And, well, I'll let Nola tell his story. Let's have a watch.
Tony and I met when we were at college together. We were both studying at what was then the London Bible College, and we became very, very close friends. And then our relationship developed from that. The thing that first drew me to him, actually, was his kindness. He was incredibly kind. I think Alzheimer's is a brutal disease. I think it robs you of things that you identify as the person in a very cruel way. So he went into hospital at the beginning of 2017. I don't know what had happened, but very suddenly the movement in his legs went and in his body, and then he was in hospital for 12 weeks. When we realised something probably was beginning to be seriously wrong, he was actually preaching in church. And he suddenly could not remember where he was going or what he was going to do. We were referred to a consultant, and when we went to the consultant, she gave the verdict. I can remember walking down the road with him from the appointment, and it's just saying, well, we're just going to make the most of every moment. There was a moment. That was when he was in hospital and when he could still speak, and they were trying to get him to walk again, and he was incontinent, and you know, there were all sorts of things going on. And he said, I just can't, I don't think I can do this anymore. And I think it's an incredibly, incredibly difficult situation, both for the person who's suffering and for their husband, wife, partner, because you feel so helpless. And I've thought about it a lot afterwards. Would I have wanted to have that option? And no, I wouldn't, because we would have missed some very precious times. That was a one fleeting moment. The solution isn't to end their life. The solution is to care for them right to the end. And I know from Tony, and I know from the sort of person he was, he would not have wanted that. And he was able to have a good end. And I would want that for everybody. And in fact, in the time that followed, he was able to be with his family, his children, his grandchildren, who all came to see him quite often. And he knew they were there. In fact, I was talking to my granddaughter just the other week, And she said, I can remember him turning and smiling at me. Grandma, he did smile at me. He'd have missed that. I have no doubt, even in the situation he was still the Tony I married. And speaking as a Christian, his identity was in Christ. He was still that person.
Okay, lastly then, before question time, what can we do? I just want to give some positive things Christians can do. Number one, let us be clear. That's what this evening's been all about. Understand the debate, understand the words, understand what arguments are being used, and be aware perhaps when emotional arguments are being told to sway our points of view. Number two, be hopeful. So I think what can happen is we can look at the moral change in our country and we can think it's all going in one direction. Actually, there is not an inevitability to this becoming legal in the UK. It's not a done deal. When it last came before the House of Commons in 2015, it was resoundingly defeated. And a lot of MPs testified, look, I had planned on voting one way, and I heard either, some of them were saying, hearing the arguments from letters from my constituents, and others said, look, even the arguments I heard in the House of Commons on the day changed my mind, so I changed my vote. There are more and more signs in our society of a kind of a progressive overreach, if you like. There are more and more warning signs from other nations that have done this. We've talked about a lot of those tonight. Be hopeful. This is not a done deal. Be praying. Lots of you have seen the prayer resources in the back table already. 10 ways to pray for the end of life is one of them. I've got copies at the back. Do take some. Be praying. Be partners with us at CARE. I talked this morning about partnering with CARE for the long haul. It's a really big step. It makes a difference. It can be financial. It really doesn't have to be. Sign up to our mailing list. Stay up to date. Pray with us. That would be wonderful. Be proactive. Write to your MP when the time comes. Write graciously and clearly and persuasively. Many MPs are surprisingly open to discussion and debate on this topic. But most importantly, finally, it's be loving. So we talked tonight about it's not just being against something, it's being for something. We're for people. We're not just about policies or positions or parties. And at the heart of this debate are people who are suffering, who are lonely, who need support and need help. If you look around the world, the most common reasons for assisted suicide, being a burden. Well, as Christians, what can we offer to people who are worried about being a burden? We can say, let's carry you. Be a burden to us. In some countries, isolation is given as a reason. What can Christians do? Say, let us love you, let us welcome you, let us offer ourselves to you. Or poverty, or addiction, or disability, or suffering. And in all of these areas, the church can show love. And so we say, people are made in the image of God. Let's not legalize assisted suicide because life is valuable. Let us also show that in the way we love and care for the people God places in front of us and invest in them and pour out our time and our hearts into them. So we're not only against assisted suicide at CARE, we are for loving our neighbour. Well, let me finish with a quote. It's from a chap called Stanley Hauerwas, maybe, an American theologian, he said, in 100 years, if Christians are known as a strange group of people who don't kill their children and don't kill the elderly, we will have done a great thing. That may not sound like much, but I think it is the ultimate politic. If we can be a community who, through the worship of God, is ready to be hospitable to new life and life that is suffering, then that is a political alternative that otherwise the world will not have. Right, over to tea and coffee, I believe. Questions to Matt? Paper here, pens here, and 10 minutes. Go.